Well, good morning, good morning, good morning. Hopefully, you can hear and see me. Hello. This is the second attempt this morning where I am. Second attempt to do this live. Little technical glitch, user error. Me thinking I had set something up to share some ideas with you, but indeed hadn't. I blame everyone else and the software. So anyway, what I wanted to talk about today was actually to revisit something that I've already talked about, and that is free will. Free will is a concept that I have really considered and ruminated about, reflected upon for many, many years. And recently, I saw a video where someone was saying, well, research proves that it doesn't exist, free will. This person's pretty well qualified, and fair enough. You know, we get stuff wrong all the time. That's part of the discourse. That's part of the dialogue, and I welcome the idea that none of us are perfect and that we have our opinions, but those opinions should be up for dialogue. So I'm not going to name the person, and this is not done in any kind of annoyed or one-upmanship way whatsoever. Quite the reverse, because what I'm going to talk about, well, I don't know the answer, but I think there's a counter argument or some different way to look at this, which I want to share with you here to suggest that free will, well, if it doesn't exist, I don't think we've proven that it doesn't. I believe that it does, and to help unpack that, I'm going to look at a little article, which I think is a really good one. I really like what this person's written. Before I do that, what I wanted to say up front is that my suspicion, apart from the fact that free will exists, is also that for, say, well, I don't know what the percentage is, 80% of the time, maybe it's 90, maybe it's 99, but a fair amount of time, we don't really think. A lot of the time, we're doing things on autopilot. You've probably heard of that phrase before, that autopilot based on habits, based on conditioning. And sometimes we simply react to what has happened the second before. You know, maybe we've had an argument with someone, so we go into a meeting or a situation and we react. And that reaction is based on a biochemical cascade, which is based on how we filtered through our beliefs and values what that interaction with this other individual was. And so, yes, much of what we do is based on the autopilot, the beliefs, the values, sometimes the family and cultural values. And more and more and more, we understand that certain things appear to be influenced by, well, the past ancestors and certainly the environment if we look at epigenetics. So all of that is in the mix. And yet, also in the mix, in the middle, in there somewhere, fleetingly, kind of out of sight, but we get just a little glance at the corner of our eyes, is our free will. So let me go over to, and I hope it works this time, is to share this article with you, which I hope you will see now. Yes, you should be seeing that. So this is by Steve Taylor. Again, I'm not going to read all of the article. I encourage you to read it, partly to keep the video short, partly because I want you to read what this person's written. They've spent some time writing it. It's from 2017, but I think it's exceptionally well done. So I'll put a link in the description to this in due course, but you can see there, Steve Taylor, Psychology Today, and Benjamin Libet. Now, I believe it's pronounced Libet. I always want to say Libe, but it's Benjamin Libet, I think, and the denial of free will. How did a flawed experiment become so influential? And this is the experiment which suggests that we do not have free will. The denial of free will is one of the major principles of the materialistic worldview that dominates secular Western society. Materialism is the view that only the physical stuff of the world, atoms and molecules, and the objects and beings that they constitute are real. Consciousness and mental phenomena can be explained in terms of neurological processes. I think they can be explained to a degree in terms of neurological processes. Of course they can. It would be foolish to suggest otherwise. And even since this article has been written, we have more and more of an understanding of what is happening in terms of the biomechanics of the brain. But is the brain the mind, and is the mind free will? So let's move on. T.H. Huxley stated in 1874, "Volitions do not enter into the chain of causation. The feeling that we call volition is not the cause of a voluntary act, but the symbol of that state of the brain which is the immediate cause." Very well written, and again, quite compelling. Then we go here. As I've said before, I'm missing out bits in the article. So please read. Huxley anticipated the ideas of some modern materialists, such as psychologist Daniel Wegner, who claim that free will is literally a trick of the mind. According to Wegner, the experience of willing an act arises from interpreting one's thoughts as the cause of the act. In other words, our sense of making choices or decisions is just an awareness of what the brain has already decided for us. I think I'll go to the shops. But no, that decision was made 10 seconds ago. You just simply the output of whatever it was that made that decision. In fact, that decision isn't really a decision. It's that cascade that I've talked about of things like beliefs, conditioning, etc. But 10 seconds later, once that last domino falls, oh, I have an idea to go to the shops. I'll call that free will, but it isn't. That's kind of the argument. In other words, our sense of making choices or decisions is just an awareness of what the brain has already decided for us. That's what that's saying. So we have an awareness, but it's after the event. Anyway, let's crack on. When we become aware of the brain's actions, we think about them and falsely conclude that our intentions have caused them. You could compare it to an imbecilic king who believes he is making all his own decisions, but is constantly being manipulated by his advisors and officials who whisper in his ear and plant ideas in his head. I think that's a very fair analogy about, no doubt, certainly from the past, kings and queens and probably present-day politicians, some. Many materialists believe that evidence for a lack of free will was found when, this is the bit of research, this is the experiment. In the 1980s, the scientist Benjamin Libet conducted experiments that seemed to show that the brain registers the decision to make movements before a person consciously decides to move. In Libet's experiments, a participant would be asked to perform a simple task such as pressing a button or flexing their wrist. Sitting in front of a timer, they were asked to note the moment at which they were consciously aware of the decision to move, while EEG electrodes attached to their head monitored their brain activity. So what did the data tell us? Libet showed consistently that there was unconscious brain activity associated with the action, a change in EEG signals that Libet called readiness potential. Bereitschaftspotential, I think, is the other word for that, mangled by my pronunciation. So this readiness potential for an average of half a second before the participants were aware of the decision to move. This experiment appears to offer evidence of Daniel Wegner's view that decisions are first made by the brain, and there is a delay before we become conscious of them, at which point we attribute our conscious intention to the act. Kind of what I was saying earlier on, that we're just the end result of this cascade and sort of retrofit what we think is a decision but is in actual fact to do with something that is autonomous. However, I like the however part. I like this bit. However, if we look more closely, Libet's experiment is full of problematic issues. For example, it relies on a participant's own recording of when they feel the intention to move. So think about it. You know, when did you intend to move? Ever been annoyed with someone and you say something that you didn't think that you should have said? At what point was the tipping point reached? At what point did you decide to say that thing? Maybe you could argue that, well, I didn't, I wasn't aware of it at all, or it was when they said that. Yeah, but at what point? Because you knew you were kind of going beyond that point of no return. When you said that thing and did that thing, this was going to dramatically damage this relationship, and you didn't really want to do that, but something happened. Maybe it was in a rage. Maybe this is an example of something that isn't free will. Maybe that's actually a great example of something that is simply based on that cascade of biochemicals. But maybe there have been times, and I can think of a few, where I just thought, I'm going to say this. I'm irritated, and I shouldn't have done. And I couldn't tell you quite where that point was, in my opinion. But of course, you may have examples where you knew exactly what it was. And I also have those as well. But I guess what I'm saying is it's fuzzy. It's difficult to know. One issue here is that there may be a delay between the impulse to act and their recording of it. After all, this means shifting their attention from their own intention to the clock. And this shift of attention, I think, is crucial, because when we shift attention, different things happen in our brains. This conscious shifting, a kind of top-down approach, as some people may describe it, rather than bottom up, where it's more reactive. So top down, we're consciously doing something. We're consciously, in this case, shifting our attention. But attention doesn't mean that this is an intention to act. This is a command to do something. It's attention rather than intention, in my opinion. In addition, it is debatable whether people are able to accurately record the moment of their decision to move. Kind of what I was saying earlier about when do we decide to say something. Our subjective awareness of decisions is very unreliable. Absolutely. 100%. If you try the experiment yourself, you become aware that it's difficult to pinpoint the moment at which you make the decision. You can do it right now by holding out your arm and deciding at some point to flex your wrist. Am I going to do it now? I was thinking about it, but no, I'm not going to do it. Hold on. Let me try and surprise myself. I kind of wasn't surprising myself. And yeah, it's really tough. And you can get into a loop and spend several hours of fun. As the psychiatrist and philosopher Ian McGilchrist, author of The Master and His Emissary, he's since then got another book out, points out while making this argument that Libet's apparent findings are only problematic if one imagines, for me to decide something, I have to have willed it with the conscious part of my mind. Perhaps my unconscious is every bit as much me. Why shouldn't your will be associated with deeper, less conscious areas of your mind, which are still you? You might sense this if, while trying Libet's experiment, you find your wrist seeming to move of its own accord. You feel that you have somehow made the decision, even if not wholly consciously. And I think that's a really important point. A couple of, I suppose, little bits to tease out there from what E. McGilchrist has said, who I think is a very smart and deep thinking individual, is that why shouldn't the decision be from our less conscious areas? Yes, that doesn't mean to say it's not free will. I'm not saying that's what Ian's saying. I'm just saying that doesn't mean to say it's not free will. And when I first heard of that experiment, I thought, but isn't that measuring something else, something deeper? This readiness that is back here somewhere, so to speak, that is more us, perhaps, than what we see, than these habits, this conditioning. something that resides, perhaps to use a phrase that is used by a lot of other people and certainly has been written about, the observing self. Maybe this is what is happening when if you practice mindfulness meditation, when you can observe thoughts, watch them come in and go and dissipate. Who or what is doing the observing? I've always found that fascinating. And maybe it's this less conscious area. And I think that also what Ian McGilchrist may be suggesting there is that this still could be not free will. So it's just something that is causing the cascade from back here that's still automatic. He may be suggesting that. I think it isn't. I think that we're measuring something interesting, but I don't think it proves the absence of free will. Quite the reverse. I think this gives us an indication that something else is going on. So to continue with the article, an even more serious issue with Libet's experiment is that it is by no means clear that the electrical activity of the readiness potential is related to the decision to move and the actual movement. Some researchers have suggested that the readiness potential could just relate to the act of paying attention to the wrist or a button, rather than the decision to move. Others have suggested that it only reflects the expectation of some kind of movement, rather than being related to a specific moment. So again, I think this is in the mix. Paying attention to. Pay attention to your foot, your right foot. Pay attention to your left elbow. And that shift in attention. And if you do it, you will notice something happening. You will notice that, yeah, I'm paying attention. What is that? Now, if we want to be reductionist about it, as the people who promulgate the idea that we don't have free will, if we want to do that, then we've still got to account for that attention shift. So how do we measure that? Where is that? What is happening there? And we can, of course, figure out when attention shifts in some ways, and we'll get better at it. But certainly, I think attention and that change in it is a good candidate for what may be being measured. And again, others have suggested it reflects expectation of the movement. So suggestion here is that we are shifting attention, and maybe there's expectation. So in a modified version of Libet's experiment, in which the participants were asked to press one of two buttons in response to images on a computer screen, participants showed readiness potential even before the images came up on the screen, suggesting that it was not related to deciding which button to press. So I'll repeat that. In which participants were asked to press one of two buttons in response to an image on a screen. Participants showed readiness potential even before the images came up on the screen. So what's that? A shift in focus, a shift in terms of expectation, a shift in attention, and so on. And maybe all of those, maybe a combination depending on what the task is. And then we'll finish the article here by this, I think, very funny quote. It's interesting to ponder why so many intellectuals are so intent with their own free will on proving that they have no free will. As the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead pointed out ironically, scientists animated by the purpose of proving themselves purposeless constitute an interesting study subject for study. That's absolutely brilliant. Yeah, their intent is showing that they basically are automatons, and all the research and intellect is nothing but that biochemical domino cascade built up over decades, perhaps thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. Anyway, so hopefully that gives you some indication as to why I think that not only was that experiment flawed, that research flawed, really quite deeply flawed in retrospect, but at the time I can see where people would jump on it. I think I believe that Benjamin Libet was actually, I think he said, I could be wrong, I don't have the quote in front of me, but I think he said that that research doesn't necessarily show, or perhaps show at all, the lack of free will. And so, to summarize that stuff, I think it is important to recognize that, yes, we do an awful lot on autopilot, more and more and more. And I think it is potentially dangerous for us to become, as we get more connected to our devices, the smartphones, the little helpers that sit in the corner that you shout out their name and they respond, this kind of hermetically sealed environment where everything is an app and a swipe up or down or left or right. I think it's so dangerous. I think we've lost in many ways the capacity to sit and simply, not, I mean, meditate, yes, but simply to be present in the moment and to consider things. One of the reasons that I believe that getting out in nature is so good for us, because we can almost go into a kind of default mode and begin to daydream and potentially process things that have happened during the day. And simply being outside in nature appears to have so many benefits for us. And yet, if we're continually doing things and stressed and anxious, then I believe that there is much less capacity to think, and therefore for a lot of the time we aren't thinking and we aren't necessarily considering our actions, and in that sense and in that way we're not acting with real free will. Again, I think a lot of the time we're just doing, but even when we're pausing a little bit, we're so wrapped up, we're so anxious that we are propelled by our emotional state, by the latest crisis at work or whatever it may be. So the need to slow down, to become mindful, to get doing things that can help us get into that state of flow, to get in nature, to really reflect. And I'm convinced that one of the reasons that writing things down, a lot of people strongly advise creating a journal and writing stuff, just writing out whatever it may be, could be connected to a goal or goals, that stuff helps us step back, helps us consider what we want to do, to make decisions using free will based on a set of, let's say, factors which are pushing and pulling us in different ways. And also, I would suggest that one of the things we have to consider is that when we look at that research, there is this idea of expectation, as I've mentioned. There is this idea of attention, as I've mentioned. There is this idea that maybe what we're doing is simply shifting our awareness. And to me, I come back to what I was saying earlier, that readiness potential, if it's showing anything, is showing that there's something behind the noise. There's something behind the automatic behaviors, the habits, the conditioning, this observing self, this deeper us. Maybe some people would describe that as the soul. And who am I to argue? I just don't think that we're non-player characters, although one could argue that sometimes we get into that zone and looking around, you can see people who possibly are in that zone. And by that, I mean that they're just not thinking, they're reacting. And that's why a lot of the time when I'm talking to people, when I'm working one-to-one with people, when I'm working in groups, I get people to relax, to consider, to calm down, to become more, let's say, I don't want to use the word because it has other connotations, but I've started the sentence, so I'll finish it. to become more mindful, and I don't necessarily mean mindful as meditation. I should be more present in the moment and aware of thoughts and more reflective. Because then what can we do? We can find ways to, well, to respond rather than to act. We can find ways to consider. We can find ways to not say that thing. We can find ways to look at people and really, I suppose, look at them through the lens of what do we have in common? How can we discuss? How can we find a solution? But if we're reactive, if we're doing things just automatically, then those reactions, particularly these days when everything is a little bit scary and a little bit uncertain, can cause us to be less than charitable, can cause us to just look for difference, can cause us to find a solution which is expedient rather than, in my opinion, which I think is very important, doing the right thing. And doing the right thing, well, that's another topic for another day. But I think doing the right thing is possible, but it's a lot easier when we are thinking about it and responding and practicing what I think we have, which is the application of our free will. Anyway, for the moment from me, bye for now.